Hello, everybody. My name is Cesar Reyes, also pronounced Cesares, and with me is my co-host.
Hi, I'm Drew Robertson, and this is LOC Unbound Books Bring Us Together. We are so excited to have John Cole joining us today.
Yes, I'm going to read John Cole's short bio as a quick introduction. John Cole retired from the Library of Congress last September after a wonderful and lucky career of 55 years as both a librarian and historian. At the heart, he is a Library of Congress and book and reading promoter, primarily through the activities of the LC Center for the Book, which Librarian of Congress Dan Boorstin created in 1977 and nabbed him as its founding director. That was, as he says, his happy job for the next 39 years until 2016, when acting Librarian of Congress David Mao asked him to become LOC's first official historian. John Cole, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, just amazing. And before we jump into our first question, I just wanted to mention that our video series does aim to highlight the 2022 National Book Festival and its theme, which is Books Bring Us Together. And we hope that our series allows us to shed light on individuals across the library and who have been involved in the book festival since the beginning, and to really emphasize the power storytelling, literature, and books have in forging connections between us all. So John, we were chatting a little bit before we started recording, and your enthusiasm is just, it's absolutely amazing. And I would love to just go ahead and hear, what's the story of the National Book Festival's creation and how are you involved in that process?
Sure, it's a good place to start, of course. As Cesar said, the kind of motivating framework for all of this was something called the Center for the Book, which Dr. Boorstin created. And it's interesting looking back on its history to see that from the first ideas for the center, which was created in 1977, we had a little subcommittee on a festival of the book. We also did things like, this was really, the purpose was to stimulate public interest in books, reading, literacy, libraries. What was different about it was that Dr. Boorstin insisted that basically it be privately funded. And he felt he needed a law at that time to authorize him as the Librarian of Congress to raise private money for this, which would be a brand new Library of Congress endeavor, because those were the days before we had a development office, if you can believe it. Dr. Boorstin didn't believe the library needed or should have a development office. Well, he learned the hard way, but his idea was correct, that he did at that point need that authorization to raise money. And Dr. Billington, who succeeded him on the sidelines, realized that when Dr. Boorstin had a little bit of difficulty with the appropriation and had to call on Congress in a special way, that Dr. Billington, wanted to clear the air and get congressional authorization for a development office, which he did within the first 6 months of his time he was librarian. So that would have happened really in early 1988. But so the Center for the Book really developed a system of state centers for the book, which really, using the private money that we had, would get states involved in doing the same things that we were involved in, but do it at the state level. And one of those ideas eventually turned out to be the big National Book Festival. But in the meantime, we had, starting in 1983, the center was started in 77, with Florida had created a network of all 50 state centers using, and that was established by 2002. So we were working in the states, and they often, had private funding, or we asked each state to really carry the ball for itself with sort of a shared way of looking at book and reading and author promotion. And the book festival idea, which really was discussed early in the first meetings, the 1978, the board meetings of the Center for the Book, also actually kind of faded towards the idea of developing national reading promotion plans or campaigns. And that was so the board's idea for the first one sounds kind of naive now, but it was the year of the reader, 1987. But then what happened was that Barbara Bush, his husband, George H.B. Bush, was elected president. She had this interest already in reading and in children's reading. And by then, Dr. Billington had become Librarian of the Congress. And Mrs. Bush knew that we had discussed with Congress the idea of getting the authorization, which we did have. And she was very curious and really asked Dr. Billington to come to the White House to talk about ways that she might help. Previously, the week before, practically, President Reagan signed the bill. Signed the bill, but it was also the national idea for a year of the young reader. And that really caught Mrs. Bush's attention. So that's when she asked Dr. Billington to come to the White House. And that was my first visit to the White House.
Wow.
I went with him and we went right up to Mrs. Bush's private quarters. They were still moving in. And Dr. Billington, she said, "What can I do to help?" And he and I had agreed that just getting her to be the national honorary chair of the campaign, after having some experience with the year of the reader and knowing it really had to be more than 1 year, and there were organizational sorts of things that we hadn't thought of. And she said yes. And 3 months later, she was reading out loud in the Great Hall of the Library of Congress to kids, which helped open the way for another Center for the Book project a decade later, which was the Young Reader Center. So some of these things all came together. But I met her daughter-in-law, Laura Bush, through the Texas Center for the Book, and which is one of those 50 states that had been created. And that was through an invitation to the Texas Book Festival, which some states had these, some didn't. I mean, a tremendous variety of kinds of things, but Texas always was a strong state. Florida was the first state, but there were numbers that had special kinds of projects. But it was Laura Bush, when she was the wife of George W. Bush, who'd been elected to governor of Texas, who had the idea of the Texas Book Festival. And so when she was elected as the first lady, she had the idea of a national book festival. And I had known her through the Texas Center for the Book and events there. And she knew the Library of Congress was really interested in this. But that wasn't the reason. She just knew of the library's reputation. And she was able to say, when she came to Washington, she was going to invite the Library of Congress to be a partner in the National Book Festival. And she didn't clear that with us at all. And it was really a good thing, I thought. And so did Dr. Billington eventually, once we did a quick recovery. And it so happened that Dr. Billington had already planned, so they had been elected, the Bushes, and already was planning the big reception the night before the inauguration, would have been January 19th, at the Library of Congress. And so everyone agreed that that was the perfect time to make such an announcement if we were able to talk ahead of time and work it out. And we were able to. So that was sort of a way that I was in on the very beginning and stayed as part of the planning committee for the book festival, which was really a privilege. And in the end, I worked on it in creating it with a woman named Joanne Jenkins, who at that time was Dr. Billington's chief of staff. And she's gone on now to become the president of AARP. And you see her nice face on a lot of the ads for AARP. But the point really was that we happily sort of backed into this. And from the Center for the Book, thinking about it back in 1977, 78, it really happened in 2001. And so that is really one of the reasons I describe my experience as happy and wonderful coincidences like this. And part of it is that we dug so hard with the Center for the Book idea early and with the partnership idea, because the only position paid for the Center for the Book was mine, and everything else had to come from private donations. This was this idea that Dr. Billington succeeded, Dr. Boorstin succeeded. So McGraw-Hill started with a gift of $20,000 to the Center for the Book and advice on how to raise more money from other publishers. So we were very publisher oriented in the early years, but that was kind of an important way to move into the book festival. And then just briefly an overview, from the beginning, Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, had her own ideas, and we had a committee of the two organizations, Joanne and myself, on the library, and with Dr. Billington watching every minute and helping us because he loved the idea. And then Mrs. Bush's staff. And what we worked out was kinds of compromises, which you don't hear much about, but it was compromises among friends. And we were at the library, eager to have it physically at the library, which we did at the beginning, as well as having it the very first book festival over on the Capitol grounds as well. And it was a planning period, which was really very exciting because we were in agreement as to what we wanted to do. And we all had ideas about authors and readings and what we should do. And I had ideas about including partnership groups that the Center for the Book already was involved in, mainly the states. But we also had nonprofit reading organizations as partners. So we had the two networks, and the reading promotion partners were part of the first National Book Festival, except we picked a terrible name for their pavilion. I insisted on calling it Great Ideas for Promoting Reading, and it turns out that got modified, and so it got known in shorthand as Great Ideas, and everyone thought it was Mortimer Adler's philosophy kind of thing. It was supposed to be down-to-earth, gutsy reading and literacy promotion. And we didn't add the Pavilion of the States, which of course now, as you know, had been transformed into several different things that it's called, but it's still there. And we got a pavilion for this. We didn't have time to do it until the second book festival, but it quickly became one of the most popular book festivals in the physical sense on the Mall. And it was Mrs. Bush that really insisted on the Mall. And of course, if you have the First Lady insisting, we were very happy to go along with that.
Yes.
And it worked out that the relationship then between the Library of Congress, which we were eager to promote, obviously, and the reading promotion side of Mrs. Bush carried over really from her mother-in-law, Barbara Bush, through Laura Bush. And we named each of them honorary chairs. We named, and including Laura Bush was actually named by Dr. Billington to be the first honorary chair of the new reading promotion plan, which I'll think of in a minute. It was Telling America's Stories, which was sponsored by the Center for the Book and the American Folklife Center. And she agreed to be the honorary chair of that in January, but it was only a few days before we announced the new book festival. And so that part of it kind of got obscured, but that's okay. That was our handle with her. And she came to the library and had an event about the Telling American Stories. And we couldn't announce the book festival quite yet because we didn't have everything together. So that is the relationship. And I was able to, stay working with both Mrs. Bush and Joanne. But since I was on the road a lot and, working with the states and with the strengthening the Pavilion of the States, in those days, it really was a major drawing point for the public. From the beginning, I was very proud of the book festival because we really reached to all elements of the public, including kids, of course, and they quickly became, a dominant part of the book festival because of not only the strength of the author programming in book children and young readers, which we later took advantage of with the Young Readers Center and the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature. This all became part of the Library of Congress for the first time, and I was able to be part of that. And I think that's really one of them. And it's now spread out throughout the library in ways that it wasn't in the beginning. And that is an important part of the library. Ironically, back when the Jefferson Building opened, and I know we're about to do another anniversary kind of celebration, it opened on November 1st, 1897. The Librarian of Congress at the time, John Russell Young, had an idea, and he called it something a little more awkward, but it was to serve young readers. And it was collection based, and he was gathering. And the idea was that the library would have children there, but then the next Librarian of Congress, Herbert Putnam, Young died in office, not a well man, he was only there for a year and a half. But his successor was a very famous librarian, Herbert Putnam. And Putnam was a professional, and Mr. Spofford, who was the longtime librarian that I studied, he was librarian from the Civil War years to the building, and his big contributions were centralization of copyright and the building. He's the guy behind the building. I always wanted the library to be open to the public. And he was able to do that when we were in the Capitol to a limited extent, but you moved to the Jefferson Building, and the idea was the public was really always going to be part of that. So, but for Mr. Putnam, children was a step too far at that point. And he was saved, if you want to look at it that way, by the opening of the DC Public Library. So in his annual reports, he said, "Oh, Mr. Young had this great idea, but there's really no need for it at the Library of Congress because we have this wonderful public library that serves young people." So he was able to concentrate on, and from the beginning, he had to be 18 or older to use the Library of Congress, which we gradually changed. But that was okay because Putnam had his hands full, and he was librarian for the next 40 years. And he built on what Spofford did. But what Spofford really brought the National Library idea to the Library of Congress and convinced Congress through things like centralization of copyright and the building that the library could be both an institution for Congress and for the public, and for that matter, for the world, because we opened up international collections. So that was kind of the way that we looked at the book festival, in a sense that it also could be open to children, and it was from the beginning. That was easy. But then we also developed other new partnerships, which I think are still there, I'm told from my friends. And that was with the American territories outside of the continental. And that really has happened largely through the National Endowment for the Humanities. And I was able to bring the humanities and the other partners in as actually financial contributors to the book festival, as well as to the Center for the Book. So the Center for the Book, we tried to play it both ways, and we continue to work on specific projects with the endowments and with our reading promotion partners, but we use that as the seed for expanding the notion of the book festival. So it, covered all parts of the public, including the teens, which became very strong, but then it became international through the Virgin Islands Center for the Book, but then the endowment putting in extra money to create different, I'm sorry, I'm missing the word, the territorial centers. So in a sense, the book festival really became a microcosm of what the library itself was striving towards and became. So the
Yeah.
book festival really has been a vehicle to help the Library of Congress expand its own horizons, which we don't think about, but in fact, that did happen.
Yeah.
And it really has turned out to be, an incredible kind of experience. I'll stop for a minute. I'm carrying on a bit, but it's really important. Book festival is really important for the library, and
Yes.
the library has benefited from it as well as contributed hugely to it by giving our staff members latitude to do kinds of wonderful things that we might not have been able to do without the national attention that the book festival has brought to the institution. So it's really been a happy experience, I think, on both sides. Not that it hasn't been a struggle, especially through the COVID and the last few years.
Of course. John, I was just talking with Drew about the richness of the history that you've shared with us and the interconnectedness that people really don't think about. And it kind of has made me curious about the early years of the National Book Festival, what the original kind of goal was for the festival, and how that kind of developed into what it is today.
Well, it started slowly. It was a wonderful day, but it was also September the 8th, 2001. And we were so happy. And I'll just describe what it was like, because we were then 9/11. After 9/11, I didn't think we would have another book festival. But anyway, let me describe what we worked up to. Was that compromise with using the Coolidge Auditorium and using both the Jefferson and the Madison buildings for programming, plus for indoor kinds of programming, plus the outside of the Capitol lawn facing the Library of Congress, for outdoor things and children's programming. And we, from the beginning, wanted to honor authors. There was no idea of the states at the beginning, of course, but that came through this Center for the Book system that I've already developed. But the notion was to promote reading. This is why Dr. Boorstin created the Center for the Book, and that's why we thought about it earlier. Promote reading, promote books and reading. Literacy gradually came into the story through both the Center for the Book and the Book Festival a little later, as did the LC Literacy Awards, which also came first to the Center for the Book and now have gone out further. But the idea was that for the first time, the library would have a public reason for outreach that was related to our mission, which increasingly became promoting reading and books. That was the little Center for the Book mission, but of course it was the broader Library of Congress mission. And Dr. Boorstin would often talk about the Center for the Book and say, why do we need a special office at the Library of Congress, even though the Library of Congress itself should really be a center for books? Well, we know the Library of Congress is much more than that. It's really a complicated government agency that needs advocates for particular kinds of missions. And what happened was that the mission of the Center for the Book and the Book Festival are pretty much the same in terms of raising public awareness of the importance of reading, thinking, and it turned out to be kind of the world that the book represents. But it isn't to just praise the book, it's through active promotion of, and that's where we got libraries into it, and we got other mission-related activities into it, that we could have a public presence that was meaningful to the mission of the institution and would have the advantage of, in our case, the first 8 years and continuing, help from the White House, which in those days was a good thing. Historically was a good thing. I've written about that. We always have tried to involve presidents and the executive branch, even though service to Congress is our major mission. Is
Yeah.
Spofford was right, and Putnam, and everybody since Spofford included the executive branch and liked this expansion of the mission. It's just that the book festival enabled us as an institution to focus on it and presented opportunities that we didn't know, might come along. Another example happened to be internationally, and that's because Dr. Billington, who succeeded Dr. Borston, happened to be a historian of Russia, and immediately invited, and I had, with the Center for the Book, had the same experience. We ended up having strong connections with reading and literacy promotion in Russia because of Dr. Billington, and the library got involved with it. But he actually invited Mrs. Putin, these are back in the days when we liked the Putins,
Really? Wow.
to be a guest at the second book festival, and persuaded Mrs. Bush, the first lady, to go with him to Russia to visit, to help Mrs. Putin kick off the first Russian book festival, which was actually their third one. And I was able to go to two others a little later. And it turned out Mrs. Putin's book festival really focused on teens. It was interesting. And so again, there was this book festival as vehicle for what different librarians of Congress could, and would do. In Dr. Borston's case, he was really kind of a showman. I mean, he loved them, and so did Mrs. Bush. So in the beginning, it was a more formal occasion than it became, and actually became less formal during those first Bush years. But there was a black tie dinner before the book had launched. Let's see, it would have been September 7th and 8th was the festival. So the black tie dinner, a formal dinner, was in the Great Hall. And when it opened, if you know how the Great Hall ascends up the stairs and goes off to the second floor of the Great Hall. Well, there was a band there, either an Army band or a White House band or something. And they announced, and Mrs. Bush and the president came down one, and Mrs. Billington came down the other staircase. And they came down the steps from the Great Hall. The Great Hall was decorated and was, a wonderful occasion, except that the White House invited all the members of the cabinet. And you don't even remember or didn't know that even the Bush cabinet was, if you look at the controversy today, but compared, to today, it was quite different. But I had authors at my table that I knew that did not care for the members of the cabinet in particular. They were all quite polite, and we had authors refuse to come. And I have that correspondence. Because they disapproved of, I'm losing it a little bit now on these things that the Bush administration was doing, and this was the good Bush administration. So it's still, but it broke down. Then the next year, for 2 more years, Mrs. Bush really wanted it to be on the formal side, and so it was black tie. But then finally, she agreed we could make that dinner much less formal and honor the authors, all of the authors, and open it up. So it wasn't really tables, and it was kind of a buffet to go to your own table, a much more wider and looser kind of event. And then gradually the Bushes warmed up to it, or Mrs. Bush and her crew. David Rubenstein, whose name you probably know, was a good friend of the Bushes, and David became a donor because we raised private money for the book festival in a big way, just like we raised private money from some of the same sponsors for the Center for the Book in a little way. So we had this other opportunity, from the book festival to stretch the library's acquaintanceship. And it was very good for us to work with the world of publishers and independent booksellers too. We gradually had to realize that we needed to sell the books that the authors were talking about. That's a big thing for the library to get into. And initially we had a contract with Barnes and Noble that there were complaints that we had gone ahead without clearing this, and people were right. So we eventually put it up for bids, and it went to independent booksellers, in particular Politics and Prose.
That's
which,
amazing.
do you know, the store in Washington? It's a wonderful store. It's out near where we live in Chevy Chase, but it's one of the largest independent booksellers in the country now.
You have such like rich knowledge of the book festival. And I had no idea that it was opened up. You know, I had no idea about opening up internationally with Mrs. Bush. And I mean, all of this is just so amazing to learn. And you've talked a lot about how the book festival affected the Library of Congress and how all of it's very interconnected at the Library of Congress. But I am curious, at your time during the book festival, when you were there, how did the emergence of the festival and the ideas that surround the festival impact the public?
Well, it was a big hit with the public, which was great. It was especially a hit, you know, when we made a comeback, because after 9/11, you know, the book, we had about 30,000 people that first time. And that was more than we'd expected. We had overcrowding, and we made a big mistake. I made a big mistake in having the book signing in the Great Hall, not knowing any better, never having done it.
Right.
We also had a lot of Library of Congress internal kinds of exhibits, which faded away as the years rolled on, and then came back with a vengeance as we had activities that involved books and reading and all of those units. But what I do recall was a concern about security. The very first book festival, 3 days before 9/11, the big event was in the Coolidge, and it turned out to be overcrowded, standing room only, and security was a problem. And because it was delayed almost at least half an hour because of people not knowing what would be happening going through security. So, you know, that was unfortunate, but then the book festival got nice publicity, but really it was, there will be a book festival after all. And I remember thinking there would never be one because our government would need to do other things. But Dr. Billington called Mrs. Bush right away, I think the next day, according to Joanne, and she was, I think, in on the call. And she said, oh no, we're going to continue it. This is the reason we have to continue it, is to show what books are in a democracy, and there's no doubt. And in fact, it brought us good publicity in the end. And it also brought us more donors because, like the Center for the Book Festival was bragging about being basically privately funded without having all the funders that we would like. And that was good publicity. And we also opened it up a little more commercially, I think is one way of putting it, for sponsors and for the public. And because from the beginning, the programming included children and young adults, the programming was okay, but the involvement of a wider span of sponsors and of public recognition came in a way because we made a comeback after a lot of people thought it was a one-shot thing, which it wasn't. And gradually, and I kept in the history of the book festival, the statistics kept going up, and word of mouth got out. And by the next year, however, was the year of the sniper in Washington, D.C.
Oh my gosh.
What happened was, I'm kind of telling it backwards. What happened was the agreement was we would go ahead, but we have much stronger security. We would not do it inside. It would all have to be outside, get outside of the Library of Congress, which was a good thing, because what happened after the first book festival is the book lines in the Great Hall just were hopeless, upstairs, downstairs. And we finally dragged the major tables outside. It was a beautiful day. And with people, and I pulled a lot of those tables with other staff members, and the lines followed us outside and then reformed.
Yes.
Wow.
And it really added to the atmosphere, and it was a lot of fun, really. But we didn't control that line very well. We couldn't. We didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
And we gradually learned. But then from the second book festival on, we knew more what we were doing. We had good publicity. We had more allies, and it started to have a much larger effect. And the numbers went up rapidly to 50,000, 100,000. And it was spectacular for the Library of Congress. And it grew, and it actually was becoming a space problem on the mall. But the second book festival, to get back to that, it had to be all in the mall, and the crowd had to walk through the machines checking you, which really we thought would cut the crowd, and it didn't. The crowd went up, but it slowed the crowd, and it slowed the amount of activity. And the second part was the sniper was running around DC, and it was a rainy day, and we thought that this wouldn't be much of a comeback, but in fact, it didn't hurt us at all. The numbers were up, and we really had a better grounding, I think, from the experience of coming back from the 9/11 and then getting through that second festival. And the third one, we didn't have to go through the machines anymore. So gradually the security opened up and we moved down the mall. And the first time we only went down the mall to where the pond is, it's just by the Botanic Gardens, that area. The next year we moved down to 7th Street. 2 years later, we were down to 14th Street.
Wow.
All the way. And then Mrs. Bush helped by hosting a breakfast for the authors. You know, we had the dinner the night before. The dinner gradually loosened up. So it was fun, and people didn't complain about having dinner with their political enemies anymore.
Right.
They may have felt that in some cases. And then they added the breakfast, and somebody donated a bus service, for participants back up to the festival. And then the Washington Post came in as a big sponsor and had a second kind of breakfast. And so gradually, and having the Post was important for publicity. And that really happened about year number 3 or 4, Drew. So it took a while, but and so Mrs. Bush, it was 8 years, and we had a wonderful event. It was her last book festival. So we did the first 8, and they were kind of in the Bush pattern, which they needed to be. So we worked, it was a cooperative kind of thing, but there were differences that we had to handle. Mrs. Bush's book festival in Texas, and they always just had authors reading from their books. And we didn't want that at all. And we wanted book talks by authors who would tell their stories, their background, and give them in their 20 minutes for 30 minutes a chance to connect with the crowd and not read to them. And we had to compromise. The first book festival had a lot of authors reading to them, but we loosened that up and they agreed. And so we gradually developed a format that worked. And gradually the support grew because of the Bush's active involvement. We did invite the Obamas once, and so this for the library, that was a different situation. And they actually on paper really were first of all, Mrs. Bush, wanted to involve her husband completely, and she did. And the Obamas did too, but they never became involved in the book festival in the way that the Bushes did. They agreed to be, the two of them, to be the honorary co-chairs of the 9th book festival. But they didn't attend, and they really didn't feel they wanted to in a way that this was Mrs. Bush started it. But it was important for us that they would accept it, so we would have the White House involvement.
Support, yeah.
But that was kind of the highlight of the White House involvement was Bush. But one of the things that happened after the Bushes left was we were starting to get overcrowded, and there was the first talk sometimes of leaving the mall, but nobody wanted to leave the mall. It was symbolic and all of that. But in the end, we had to, because of the Park Service and the overcrowding and the remodeling of the mall. And we were having crowds that were over 100,000. And and also on the sponsorship part, Mr. Rubenstein stepped up after Mrs. Bush left, and he really became the major individual sponsor, as he has since then, of so many things cultural in Washington. But he's been very loyal to the library, and guess what? He's from Baltimore, where Dr. Hayden is from. They've known each other for years.
Wow.
And so that friendship and Dr. Mr. Rubenstein has been a wonderful friend of the library. He now, I believe, is still the chair of our Madison Council. The Madison Council, which you may or may not know, really was drawn into supporting the book festival in those early years when we didn't quite have the corporate support. So some of those individuals, and that's how Mr. Rubenstein, who now today is the chair of them, which is the major fundraising group for the library, which Dr. Billington created. But it was business people. And so it's not really open to everybody, but you don't want everybody in it because you want the people who become loyal to the library. And a lot of the Madison Council people get attached to certain collections like maps or prints and photos or movies, and they want to help support in a serious scholarship in a serious way as well. So that's, but Mr. Rubenstein stepping up to do that really secured the future of the book festival immediately in the post-Bush years. And so that really meant that Dr. Billington remained librarian and remained a very strong supporter, but he also had these other ideas. I mentioned the Russian one in particular,
right.
But there were others, and they related to the Center for the Book. We really had some exhibits on books that made America, and we actually at the book festival celebrated some of the exhibits that the Library of Congress had done, and got some of the divisions involved in ways that they had not been. And now that it's gone online in all kinds of, completely for a few years, that's opened up different kinds of opportunities, I think, for the library to make its mark nationally and internationally, actually, but for sake of United States, just make it a national mark. And Dr. Hayden has, followed that in every possible way. And as a public librarian, you would expect that. And with Mr. Rubenstein as a helper and a financial supporter, the book festival has become even more important, I think, to the library than it was in the beginning. I saw one of your questions. Once I stepped down as author coordinator, I kind of moved away from the book festival because by then I had other projects such as the Library of Congress Literacy Awards, which were important, and I had to focus. But I stayed in touch always with the Pavilion of the States because I know a lot of those people. And I was, kind of an advisor in part to Dr. Billington's. I really got started with Dr. Boorstin when he asked me, because he knew of my interest in the library, to chair the task force on goals, organization, and planning. I really spent a year. I was a collections librarian at the library, but I'd written my PhD about Mr. Spofford, and I was writing articles about the national role of the Library of Congress when Dr. Boorstin was nominated. and a couple of my articles were actually published in his hearings because they were shared. And that's how he knew of my interest. But he came to the library with the book, Center for the Book idea. And he asked me to chair his 1 year because of my interest in the library's history. And I was a young collections librarian, but had a PhD and knew about the library's history. So I chaired his 1 year survey of the library and published a book about it called The Library of Congress in Perspective. And the advisory board, we had funding. Dr. Boorstin got a lot of money for this from 75 outside advisors. And we divided them. This was 1976. The year was 76. That's right. And the advisors were divided into 5 or 6 groups. And one of them was the publishing advisory group. And in fact, Dr. Boorstin saw that and knew the man who chaired that, whose name was Dan Lacey, who was an important executive at McGraw-Hill. And there were other publishers, but then there was one for law, there was one for social studies, there was one for different fields. And the advisors, all came and participated, but with things coming together, the publishing advisory group had people who were formerly been on something. I'm getting into the history of the Center for the Book, but I'm not going to be there very long. But some people came to the advisory board, and then Dr. Boorstin and then Mr. Lacey, Dr. Boorstin tried out the Center for the Book idea on Mr. Lacey, who of course loved it because he was part of the publishing community that worked with libraries and created National Library Week. Yeah. And actually, Mr. Lacey came to the Library of Congress back in the early years from the National Archives. So he was a pro-LC guy right to the day he died. And he and Dr. Boorstin decided that as part of the task force recommendation, their first recommendation would be that Dr. Boorstin create the Center for the Book, which of course was Dr. Boorstin's idea. And he was determined to do this, but he developed a wonderful way to involve his whole organizational scheme to help kick off certain projects that needed, it was a brand new idea. And then that was actually how the $20,000 came from McGraw-Hill, was because of course, Mr. Lacey, and these are all good things, was able to give startup money. And so the Center for the Book became a Library of Congress, not just the Daniel Boorstin project, and got that started. And that's how, the evolved. Then I was asked to, once I'd finished the chairing and put out the book, I was put in the planning office of the Library of Congress, but Dr. Boorstin fingered me early on and said, John, you're it. You're going to be the director of this if we can do it. Wow. I didn't know, but of course I wanted to do it. So that's how it started, but it kind of grew organically. And then Dr. Boorstin remained a very strong supporter, as Dr. Boorstin was. I mean, Dr. Boorstin and then Dr. Billington. Again, my Dr. B's always have gotten them mixed up.
Dr. B's.
They both ended up really being very supportive because both of them were book people, really, and loved books and loved reading. And the Library of Congress had not formally recognized that in terms of an organizational unit. So they both saw that opportunity that we've already talked about earlier, that they came at it from kind of a different perspective in terms of what their contribution to the Library of Congress would be after they left. And of course, Dr. Boorstin did leave, retired to keep writing. He was a historian of America. And Dr. Billington was a different personality, a different view. He stayed a long time, but his views of the Center for the Book remained intact. And I was able to work with him, on some of his projects and use, another Billington idea was author talks at the Library of Congress that we didn't have earlier. And so the Center for the Book started that. It's called Books and Beyond. And we had to go and get current authors. And I used the peg that the subject of their book would be related to the Library of Congress. Either they used our collections or they were a project of the library. And we had to get special permission to sell their books at the library. This is all pre-book festival, but you see, it ties to the book festival.
Yeah.
Sure.
So Books and Beyond started in 1996. Yeah, book festival was 2001. So we had 5 years of these author talks. And in a way, I view it as kind of a warm-up in a way for, these were one at a time, but we had over 20 years, we had 350 authors or something, but we started 10 years before the book festival. So suddenly the book festival, John Cole, how many authors are you going to invite? Well, I don't know, 20? No, not enough, 30? Well, let's experiment. And so the first one was 30 to 40 authors.
Mhm.
And then we learned how to get publishers to pay for their authors as much as possible. But if not, we had backup money. And so that grew. And so now I saw online we have, we have 120 authors or something like that signed up.
Yeah.
Huge. Yeah.
But that's an example of how, we expanded the book festival for the library, and the library, helped us expand the book festival. So it really is tied into the library's mission, in a way. And then the office that, you're reporting to now grew out of the Center for the Book, because we had lots of other projects.
Right.
And we slowly recruited more and more people from the library to help in the early years. It always was a Library of Congress project. I was just lucky enough to be an integral part of that all the way. And since I'm such a LC supporter, as you can tell, I can, visualize, in a sense, a future where the book festival is even more important as, for the library itself.
John,
And you
I'm
must
curious.
have seen some of these actually from the inside of the library. I mean, you can see reaction to it. People love it, but sometimes they don't know about it. And especially since we went through an online period,
Right.
and had to start again. I think we're kind of, in a sense, starting again with the in-person kind of activity. Well, do you remember what the last one was? But when we went online, the last 2 or 3 at least, but wasn't it?
Yeah. I think the last 2 have been online. I believe so.
Now it's going to be hybrid. It's going to be hybrid now, I believe. So it's going to be in person and online now. So we'll have both
Yeah.
best worlds.
So it is.
Yeah.
So, those are all good things.
John, I am curious. You've had a long tenure at the library, not only working at the National Book Festival, but also as the historian for the Library of Congress. I'm curious now in your retirement, how has your involvement with the National Book Festival changed, just as a patron maybe, or someone who visits it? Do you see it in a different light now that you're, not behind the scenes, but just experiencing it as someone who loves books?
Not really. I mean, you just expressed it. I mean, I like it and I'll go along with whatever. I'm not part of it.
Right.
So I just enjoy watching it expand.
Yeah.
And I have worked on other parts of the library. I mean, do you have copies of America's Greatest Library? Did that get sent to you in some way? Do you know of that book?
I don't, but I'd love to read it.
Well, it's in the shops. It's my 3rd large book about the library's history. It's modestly called America's Greatest Library, an illustrated history of the Library of Congress. And Dr. Hayden wrote the preface. And it's the Library of Congress from the beginnings up to Dr. Hayden. And it's an illustrated history. I'm surprised you don't, they should really furnish you with a copy.
I'd be happy. I'd be happy to have a furnished copy.
Talk to the right people. I mean, it's in print. My other books, most of them are in the shop, but they're out of print. But that one is still is, and that, so I have worked on lots of other things at the library, much more than, especially since 2014, since I kind of stepped aside. But so I've done lots of other books, and actually the library is asking to get my own papers and archives, which will be good for the library because it's filled with raw material that would be useful that I've used for my books and articles about the library. So we're kind of in a discussion period where I'm describing what I've got to give and what I want to give. And I, of course, have ideas how it might be used too, based on my experience. I've just been very lucky that, the library has recognized the fact that I love the library. I like to research it. I like to write about it. And the library has been very supportive in that. And I've done that my whole career. I mean, while I was part of the Center for the Book, I also did histories of lots of articles and several books about the library. My big one is called the Encyclopedia of the Library of Congress, which you would not have seen probably because it's a big reference book. As a book, it was published in 2004. It was a 10-year project. And I asked, and it's a big 500 or 600 page book, long out of print, but available online if you know how to do it. But and that was great because I invited the library specialists from all over the library to write about their history of their collections and their administrative units. And then, we put it together, and then with essays and then alphabetical entries about the Library of Congress. And so, that was actually came out after the book festival had started. It came out in 2004, but subsequently there have been other books and activities, and I'm now, working to see that what we started with a historian's office is continued, and they're going to fill the job, but it's going to be under some kind of a different arrangement. But in fact, there are ways that I think what I'm leaving to the library can be used for the office and for the new historian. And I would love to see the library do even more about its history. And that it would include the divisions and the collections but the encyclopedia has, the history of automation. It has the history of all aspects of the library up to 2004. But then we really started to grow.
There's a lot of years after that you could.
That's right. And our collections have just, multiplied tremendously. But I was lucky to be around, for the big kind of expansion, the international expansion with Title II-C and Public Law 480 and the establishment of the overseas offices. And I took it upon myself to advocate myself I was recruited by the library. I showed up on the doorstep, but they had a program called the intern program back in the late 60s when I came. And if you applied, you had to be an outstanding graduate of a library school. This is all very old fashioned. And if you were nominated by your library school and made it, then you got a 9-month training program and a guaranteed job at the Library of Congress.
Wow.
In those days,
I wish.
that was a big deal. So then I stayed on as a advisor to that program and helped widen it. So it also included LC employees, but now it's gone because there are a myriad of new intern kind of programs, including minority programs and all of that. But that's when I advocated. I saw a little loophole in what they were offering, and it said at the end of your internship, and there were 16 of us that year, you could spend 2 weeks at an optional period anywhere you wanted in the library. And it turned out that was the year the library opened its London office. And so a buddy of mine and I had the nerve he pushed me, but I went along with him. Advocate to the Mr. Mumford, whom we had barely met, that we spend our time in London visiting the office. And
Very
he didn't
cool.
know what to do with this. I still have the petition. We really was a petition practically. But a man named William Welsh, who was the man in charge of the processing department, was the one who reacted to it. And he, rather than rejecting it, said, that's a great idea. But and he soon was on his way to becoming Dan Vorson's deputy. So I mean, this was kind of a plot on their part. And I didn't know about it at all.
Yeah.
This was when I was still just my first years.
Yeah.
And he said, well, resend it. You will have to, if we do it, you have to pay for it, for sure. And you would need to, but you need to give yourself a better professional experience. And you would be bored to death working in the Library of Congress shared cataloging office in London, which was cataloging. But why don't you submit, and I can see this was an opportunity, to spend time at the British National Bibliography, the British Museum Library, at the library, spend time, and he said, try for maybe the National Library of Ireland. And we, the library, if you pay the expenses, we would give you the break of supporting you officially. And that's what happened. So we resubmitted it and the library approved it. And so we visited the London office, and then I went to work in collections development, and my friend Art Plotnick went on to work for the American Library Association. And I used that gimmick, if you will, as a collections librarian to visit the overseas offices at my expense, but with official library recognition. So that was before I actually met my wife, Nancy, who also I met through the intern program. And then she went on to become the director of the Smithsonian Libraries.
Wow.
On my own, before I met her, I visited the Tokyo office, and I visited the New Delhi office. And then later, after we were married, I of course knew the people who ran those offices, but I started the idea and got interested in the overseas offices. So that's, I've used all of that. And, I just came across another article that I did, but I've lost it, and then I found it, but it was been 10 years ago, and it's how the Library of Congress became a world library. And it's, I'm just proud to be part of it and to be able to, try to sell this idea of the importance of the Library of Congress, in all of its glory. It has so many different roles. It's, nobody can understand it completely. There are little worlds that are part of the Library of Congress that we just see the surface. And sometimes it's the specialist in that area, and then they represent the whole other world. Maps would be one example, prints and photographs another. And, these are really important. Copyright, Lord knows that's an important world. And, each of these divisions and offices, have a world they represent, and they bring to the table that knowledge that they also, on the other side, have things to offer about the Library of Congress. And I've loved being, trying to share knowledge about what the library does, because basically, we have been a very conservative institution. And the other thing that the book festival has done, as I kind of implied that earlier, is opened it up to the world, whether we like it or not. If you step up and say you're doing the National Book Festival, you're going to end up doing things that you'll want to do things that other people suggest. And a lot of that is online, I think, because that opened that up too. But, we have become, because of the festival, we've become a much better known, and I think a much better organization because of not being quite as shy or as protective as many parts. We're librarians. I mean, parts of what we do, are very detailed and very important, and to other people seem like not important. things, but they really are.
Yeah.
So we have to do this kind of balancing and outreach, whether we like it or not. And with the book festival, same is true. It's out there. We're out there.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we better respond. And so that's why I'm so glad the library has, taken on the book festival as a little office and promoting it.
So, yep.
And it's really important for the future of the organization. And it's just happened that way. It's kind of been a natural evolvement.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's been a desirable one from different points of view, and that is, dragging us into being responsive to new sets of constituencies that we may not have thought of.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do the job of the book festival in the technology, in the new world, digital world, we've got to come through. And we have. And we have been so lucky, actually, in our librarians that there hasn't really been, in recent times, there really has never been a complete dud. But there've been a couple of that haven't been around so long. But since Mr. Spofford, who has had the National Library idea, every single librarian has accepted the notion that we are national as well as congressional. Mm-hmm. And it's the expansion of the national side of things that has really interested me as an outreach kind of person, and then constantly reassuring Congress that we also are doing a better job for them because we are broader in scope than just doing what they want us to do. We're bringing things to the table. And that's what CRS has done. I don't know whether you know much about it, but they really, in their world, there's another world there, are important in the national conversation. One of the things Dr. Billington was so good at was really working with Congress in every way and informing them and involving them in both the book festival, and even like the Gershwin Awards. I don't know whether you know about those. But, it's a wonderful, development of kind of outreach for the music division, which does a terrific job. Another world. But if you look at the Gershwin concert each year that we've done with WITA and with others, we drag out our congressional committee. So we bring members of Congress who are introduced. This year, Dr. Hayden introduced members of the Congress that are friends of the library, including a couple of members of the committee that are advisors to the library, and pulled them into seeing what the Library of Congress does for the world of music and popular culture through the Gershwin Award. And so they're going to be, so we are no longer as afraid as we were in the early years, even the early years of the book festival, of being involved in celebrity kinds of outreach.
Yeah.
Which is, we're the perfect place to do it. We just obviously haven't always known it or wanted to do it. And now the book festival has helped us do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the book festival is certainly created a grand space for the library, right? And you've talked about this sprawling history of the Library of Congress, and your history with the library is absolutely amazing. Having started there so early on in your career and been there and witnessed all of this and been such an integral part. It's just absolutely amazing. And I want to ask a question that kind of brings us back in a little bit to you as like personally. The idea behind this year's National Book Festival is that, books bring us all together, and that in some way books connect us all to each other, and storytelling connects us all to each other. And so what is a recent book that you've read that you feel would connect others to you?
Well, I saw your question and I thought about it. And actually, I was thinking about books in my own life. And I think one way of answering it is I thought of 3 books that really have been important to me, and I recommend them to everybody. So that's sort of what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so see if I can remember them. The kids' books were Make Way for the Ducklings. And what was the other book about the mouse? I'm trying to think of it. Stuart Little.
Oh, I
Those
love
were
Stuart
two-
Little.
Do you know either of those books?
Yes.
Now, those were books that I grew up loving because of my parents, and they read them to me. And then
Sure.
suddenly, when I got thrown into the world of children's literature through the Center for the Book and the Book Festival in particular, I felt I had at least a little bit of a historical interest, and always had maintained kind of an interest in children's authors because of the authors of those books. Then the scholarly part, I've always had a favorite book, which I do recommend to people, and it's called The Scholar and Adventurers. And you've probably never heard of it. It was by a man named Richard Altick. And it was published in the 60s, I think. And it told stories of scholarship all over the world, but mostly England and America, and the adventures of making discoveries, of scholarly discoveries that were important for the scholarly world. But it covers different fields: literature, science, archaeology, different kinds of things. But that obviously shaped me, because I don't know what I was thinking. This would have been college days. And I found that book. And it was before I decided to become a librarian at all, that I wanted to read and maybe have a scholarly career.
Yeah.
And then the third one I thought of is an old friend, which is about Washington, D.C. We love the history of D.C. And of course, Nancy and I have lived here for now decades. And it's a book, now am I going to blank on it? I don't think so. I'm after, but it's a man who in World War II worked in Washington, and he cycled. I must have a name of it somewhere. He cycled up to Washington to work in the Pentagon. And it's about springtime, spring in Washington. That's it.
Right.
And it's been reprinted many times. And what it really brought to me was kind of a love ahead of time of Washington, D.C. that I knew about. And then suddenly, when I had an opportunity here, and that came to me through the Army. I was ROTC all the way, no choice in those days.
Yeah.
And signed up to be for Army counterintelligence. I thought that was going to be exciting.
Wow.
And I did make it into Army Intelligence School, so going by way of a second lieutenant out of the University of Washington. And I qualified, and I went to Fort Benning for infantry officers basic, and then up to Fort Holabird near Baltimore for the Army Intelligence School. And then they discovered I had a library degree. I stayed at the University of Washington. I postponed going in the Army in order to get my library degree, which was one of the smartest things I ever did. In those days, it was librarianship or whatever. Then they noticed in the Army that my class of all young officers was headed for Vietnam. This was 1965,
Wow.
66. But this captain who did the assigning saw that I had a library degree, and he made me the head of the U.S. Army Intelligence School Library.
Wow.
Because he had a civilian vacancy, and it allowed him to fill that. The library had 3 civilian positions, 12 enlisted, which did all of the classified stuff. And then he had a vacancy as the head of the library, and he assigned me to it without ever telling me, which was fine. But when I learned, my class went on to Vietnam, I stayed, and I learned that I could get surplus books for my it was like a foreign affairs library, intelligence, from the Library of Congress surplus duplicate collection. And I could get a car and a driver to take me down there to do this. And I did it. and I fell in love with the Library of Congress. I did it just to go to the Library of Congress after a while, and said, wouldn't Washington be a great place to live? I read this book, Spring in Washington, I think it is. And it just sounded like an adventurous kind of place. And so those were three books. I would say that kind of the idea of kids' literature came from those two. But then the scholarly side and then the DC side, both came from my own book. And of course I collect, we won't go into that, but I have my own collections, which I'm going to donate to the Library of Congress.
Yes.
So, books have been part of my life completely. And so I'm a bookie at heart, but I've learned to be an outreach person. And this is kind of parallel with the Library of Congress, kind of internal bookish, not bookish, but library-ish, that really needed to reach out. And for me, both the Center for the Book and the Book Festival have done that. And being able to work directly with these librarians of Congress, I mean, what a privilege. And I stumbled into because I love the library's history.
And I'll say your enthusiasm for books, your love for the Library of Congress definitely comes through in how you talk about its history. It's infectious, really. And I can't thank you enough for the time you've spent with us today. It has been super fulfilling to just know how everything's kind of so interconnected, how there's little building blocks that kind of lead to where we are today. And that kind of leads me to, I guess, our last question for the day is, what does it mean to you when you hear books bring us together?
Well, it just brings a very familiar, it's just another one of the themes in a way. I've spent my life developing ideas and gimmicks for book programs because I believe so strongly that books are a way to connect with the world. And so to me, it's, it's kind of a demonstration of my own life in a way that I've used books to meet people. I mean, there's a narrow sense of this. One would be a practical vehicle for, talking and learning and getting along in life. But another part of it is sort of idealism. And I look at the books on my shelves and my collections, which I nurture and I love, and I want to pass on to the Library of Congress. And, there's a symbolic part of the world of books that I feel when I look at some of my collections and actually as I dispose of some of my books, which is really what I'm doing now, that, is the internal part of me, but then there's that secondary outreach part of sharing the book and sharing reading experience. It's kind of like reading aloud in a way is a wonderful thing that Nancy and I have really developed later in life is sharing on a one-to-one basis. But the opportunities are all there in books, and that's really what what we're about, I think, in all these different ways. It's kind of like a cliche, but that's, I looked through the themes, we had to come up with themes for the Center for the Book every year for, for first ladies and for, other people to tie onto. And, books bring us together. Books make a difference was the theme we used for 5 years. It grew, It grew into Letters About Literature, which was another student program that was developed, and it's a student writing program that lasted for 15 years at least. And at one time, and we had over 100,000 students writing letters to their favorite authors. And we had a judging system that was very practical, very positive one for the state centers. The Target came in and funded that for 6 years. They were so impressed. And so we hired people to run it for us at the library. The Center for the Book really had to hire people to do things because our staff was never bigger than 4. And 3 of them were paid for on private money. But that was an example of slogan that that really made a difference. It's just another aspect of the world of books. You can cut it in so many different ways. Trying to think of the other theme that we used. Explore new worlds, read was one year's theme, and we could that. So we looked at geography, and I got the map, LC Geography and Map Division to be a co-sponsor with us, just like the American Folklife Center was this co-sponsor of Telling American Stories.
Yeah.
So these were 2-year themes, and we had about 6 of them for 2 years. There were 12 years of themes. It got didn't get tiresome because it was different each time. But it just shows in a way the flexibility of this notion of sharing books and reading and their importance, both in physical objects, which was another aspect of what we worked on, but also the best part of it was the reading promotion. And I'll end with one final thing I just thought of when, so Dr. Boorstin pushed this idea of the Center for the Book. What he really liked was using technology to promote books and reading, television. And so our first big plan to read more about it with CBS television lasted 14 years. And we put these tag-ons to CBS programs, including the US Open tennis and all kinds of things. This is all, I've written about all of this. So at any rate, that was kind of I read more about it was that particular theme. And when, I know what I was going to say. So Dr. Boorstin had that first interest, and he pushed us in television, the book in the classroom, books in the future, how does technology affect books and reading, themes we had all the way through. But reading came to us actually in a very interesting way. Promoting reading is not in the law of creating the Center for the Book. It's all kinds of other bookish things, exhibits and scholarly programs and stuff. But then when President Jimmy Carter signed the bill in 1977, and he said, I sign this as evidence of my belief, not only in scholarship, but my belief in promoting books and reading to the American people. He mentioned reading. And of course, to raise money for the Center for the Book, you can't do it for scholarly reasons, but you certainly can do it for reading and reading promotion. And so in some ways, it was President Carter. I mean, I look at this, nobody else would know this at all. It makes no difference except to me. Because when I saw that, I said, that's what we're going to hang this on. In the beginning, talking about reading promotion. And later it became literacy promotion. I mean, it includes literacy promotion. But I said, reading promotion is the vehicle with books, but not just books, reading, for reaching out and building what Dr. Boorstin really thinks of as the Center for the Book, which is book being a center for ideas and sharing, not solely the physical book or solely the scholarly book. It's the reading, act of reading. So when I met Mrs. Carter, we had a lunch for her, I told this story to her, and she went back and told, this was just 10 years ago, and she went back and told Jimmy, and I got a note, and he said he'd never heard that, but I have actually a photograph of his writing on his signature.
Awesome.
This shows that the American people we need to promote reading among the American people. That's how I took it. And so later I heard back from him that she had told him about this. And so we had a very brief exchange of letters, but that was just another interesting thing in the history of the Center for the Book. That it helped another US president expanded our horizons, and I think helped make us a success.
Yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much for not only sharing your knowledge and history, but also a little bit of your story, which I think really adds to the richness of everything that you've told us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Good luck to both of you in your careers. You've chosen the right area, and I know you'll take advantage of it. Okay?
Most definitely. Thank you, John, again, and take care.